On Tuesday of this week, Secretary of Defense James Mattis spoke before the House Armed Services Committee. And among the other things he said, he told them that we will continue to prosecute the campaign against terrorism, but in our new defense strategy, great power competition, not terrorism, is now the primary focus of U.S. national security. And my question to you is, how do you believe that'll impact the fight against terrorism?
Sure. Well, I think he did emphasize a shift. I think that great power competition has always been a focus of national security strategy, as has terrorism. I think perhaps he was trying to emphasize a focus on Russia and China and countries like Iran and North Korea in some of his remarks before armed services. But when you look at the worldwide threat assessment, for example, that was put out by this administration in 2017, terrorism remains a key and integral threat. So I think that it would be a mistake to sort of downgrade terrorism at the expense of great power competition. The nature of the threats are different. And I think when you look perhaps in terms of resource allocation, when you're focused on traditional conflict, weapons, there's more resources perhaps being focused on those issues at places like the Pentagon. But that's because the fight against terrorism is somewhat of a different type of fight, a fight that we've been fairly successful on the military side of the equation, a fight that really now relies a lot more on the ideological side of the equation, relies a lot more about what's happening online with terrorist organizations and less traditional forms of conflict. So I think they're both important threats. I wouldn't want to sort of rank them against each other. The nature of them is quite different. I think Mattis was trying to put a focus in terms of resource allocation, at least that was my impression, on the great power threats from China, Russia, Iran, North Korea.
So, again, how do you think that will impact the fight against terrorism in the U.S.?
Well, I hope it doesn't impact the way that our country is dealing with terrorism, because while the threat has been substantially reduced in places like Syria and Iraq in terms of gaining back territory and perhaps even reduction of fighters, that doesn't mean that ISIS or terrorist organizations are retreating by any means. In fact, we see them ramping up a lot of their efforts to expand globally. Personally, I think that the United States should continue to prioritize terrorism. And I think we are. I mean, I think you'll see in the upcoming worldwide threat intelligence assessment, just like last year, I assume terrorism will remain front and center as it has been. So personally, I think there should be more resources put into the ideological fight against terrorism. We've done a good job on the battlefield. I think you should see more resources going towards what's happening online with the expansion of their messaging, and also in terms of homeland security and defensive measures are where it's really critical to ramp up with regard to counterterrorism.
Yes, you've had a chance to look at some of his remarks regarding this threat and what indeed the Pentagon and the military are going to do as an overall entity when it comes to the defense strategy. But the Pentagon and the military, DoD, plays a huge role in the counterterrorism fight, doing things overseas that others can't do. So if there is a change, how would that happen?
You raise a really good point. I mean, in his remarks, I think part of it may have also been these remarks were also jointly addressing the nuclear posture review, in which case you'd be emphasizing great powers or countries that have nuclear resources at their disposal as a threat in order to justify certain resource allocations in the defense arena. Having said that, I think you're absolutely correct. I would not want to see reduction in resources allocated towards terrorism at the expense of these other issue areas by any means. I think it's extremely important and critical to ramp up, not just at the Pentagon, but allocations and funding, for example, at the State Department on offices that deal with these issues, allocations at Department of Homeland Security, all critical. And also to note that it's going to be a collaborative effort between the government and the private sector on some of these issues, like the technology companies who also have a role to play in all of this. So I think the nature of the fight is different in some respects. I personally, if I had been Mattis, might not have phrased it as sort of an either or. I think they're both critically important. It's just the nature of the threats are very different in terms of how we fight them and the types of resources and the way that we address them.
I've spoken with a couple of former directors of three-letter agencies within the last couple of weeks, And one thing that's very interesting that they mentioned seems to concur with what Matt has said, and this is completely a completely apolitical scenario. But they were saying that the U.S. did focus very intently on terrorism after 9/11, and I've seen and heard from military people for years that they felt they were getting too deeply enmeshed in that whole process. Is there a safe way to pull back in this process?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting to think about when it comes to terrorism is obviously the even the most tragic of terrorist attacks is not necessarily the same threat or the same damage that can be brought about if there were, for example, a large-scale military conflict between great powers or a nuclear conflict between two countries. Having said that, there's always the potential for terrorist actors to coordinate or combine their efforts with traditional state actors, which I think is also important to recognize as you make this distinction. That it's not always either or. And something, that individuals in the security realm have always been worried about are terrorist actors getting their hands on weaponry from great power or non-great power states, for example, whether that's nuclear material or biological or chemical. That's something that is also of critical concern. So I think that needs to remain front and center, as well as the cyber threat from both countries and potentially non-state actors. To your point, yeah, I mean, to some degree, the threat that we see now it has changed and evolved since 9/11, and there was obviously a substantial ramping up of resources, but that substantial ramping up of resources has prevented another 9/11 style attack from happening.
Yeah.
So, on the one hand, we may have overreached or escalated perhaps more than we needed to, but it's really difficult to assess that. I'd say we've been successful.
And now is not the time to pull back, I hear you're saying. So it seems as though they're thinking ISIS and other terror groups are maybe under some level of control right now. We know that ISIS appears to be less tangible in terms of a physical presence. Where do you think they're going?
Well, I think what we've seen is a trend as they've lost ground in Syria and places like Raqqa, as they've lost ground in Iraq. You've seen their messaging shift from talking about the caliphate and individuals coming to those places to really a message that is all about expansion and basically trying to inspire individuals all around the globe to take part in ISIS affiliated or ISIS inspired attacks. And you see that they have really moved their messaging to represent that viewpoint, and they've been happy to claim attacks by individuals all around the globe. So I think that the real area of concern is that we're going to continue to see the types of attacks that we've seen over the past 2 years in Europe, for example, using vehicles, using knives. Hopefully we can maintain these types of attacks. There is no manageable level because they're all horrific and tragic, but we haven't fortunately seen anything on the scale of a 9/11 attack. The attacks that took place here, for example, in the United States in New York, while horrific and tragic, were not, mass casualty terrorism attacks. So I think the real concern is just a continuation of these lower scale, require low training, low sophistication terrorist attacks all around the globe on soft targets.
Just briefly, do you think the pivot or the shift from terrorism as the primary focus to great power competition being the primary focus will open the door to terror organizations, either in their thinking and their calculus, or perhaps even in their actions to engage in attacks?
Sure, that's a really interesting point. Sort of, are the terrorists paying attention to our own rhetoric about the threats that we are focused on? I think they'd be mistaken if they think that it's going to be any easier for them to carry out an attack. We have some of the best law enforcement intelligence agencies in the globe operating here and in Europe, and I think it still remains quite difficult for an organization to carry out a highly sophisticated and coordinated attack. Having said that, terrorists do pay attention to our words, and I think that for the United States to keep the pressure on terrorist organizations, it doesn't just require putting money and dollars and resources into the problem, but it requires taking a firm position rhetorically as well, because terrorist organizations, believe it or not, do track and do use our words in their propaganda messaging for their own recruitment purposes and also in terms of their strategy. So I think you do raise a critical point that even if we do scale back, we do want to keep our rhetoric firm and we don't want to downplay the prioritization of terrorism. And I hope that you'll see terrorism reiterated in not just the Senate Intel hearing next week on worldwide threats, but in our worldwide threat assessment that I believe will come out again, later this year, as it usually does, where terrorism has always been front and center, and I'm sure will continue to be this year.
Tara Maller, spokesperson and senior policy advisor at the Counter-Extremism Project and a former CIA military analyst. J.J. Green, WTOP News.